Chapter 9. Whodunit. It was cold in the courtyard just outside of Manglos's room. Sometime during the night it had started to snow, and even though the snow wasn't settling, it added an extra chill to the air. Tanegi was resting with her back against the wall of the old keep, her wings folded lazily so that they hung loosely from her back. It took her a moment before she even noticed that Reyes had arrived. Quinnigoff was a little more alert. She had taken her perch on one of the more stable of the unstable railings that surrounded the various balconies of the keep. She had chosen a room on the first floor, her ceremonial spear resting lightly against another part of the railings. Her perch gave her a good view of the courtyard, while keeping her close enough that she might converse with Tanegi. They weren't alone in the courtyard. A line of peasants were queuing up to draw water from the well. It would have been impossible for them not to have seen the harpies, and yet this time there was no panic. Word must have gotten round to the four corners of the encampment that there were harpies nearby, who were loyal to the king. As soon as she saw Reyes, Quinnigoff took to the air. She hadn't been that high up, and could probably just have jumped down. But instead she flew a half-circuit towards a line of peasants, as if she was teasing them, before she came in to land next to Tanegi. "How is she, my chief?" Reyes found it strange that a harpy like Quinnigoff would worry about Gaggara. After all, they had only been at the village for a very few short days. Then again, maybe some of his own concerns about his girlfriend had started to rub off on the huntress. "She'll live." "That's good, my chief," Quinnigoff cooed. Tanegi didn't speak. She nodded her head in agreement, though, and then she yawned rather loudly. Reyes glanced meaningfully at Tanegi. "Aren't you supposed to be on night duty? I'm glad that you were worried enough about Gaggara to stay up, but you should really go and get some sleep." "I just got promoted," Tanegi replied. She sounded both cheerful and very tired. "Quinnigoff seemed to think I was the most suitable to take over the vacant spot of day guard." "I see," Reyes said appraisingly. "Well, congratulations." "Thank you, boss," Tanegi replied, yawning again. "What of Heshkov?" Reyes asked. "Heshkov will continue to watch over you at night with whoever she happens to find to replace Tanegi, my chief," Quinnigoff uttered. "Any idea who she'll get?" Reyes asked. Even as he asked the question, he realized that he didn't really know many of the girls in the village that well anyway, and doubted he'd recognize a name. "I have an idea, my chief," Quinnigoff replied. "I even gave her a few suggestions. It should make things easy for her." "Oh?" Reyes asked. "So who did you suggest?" "Well, my chief," Quinnigoff began, looking a little guilty as she spoke, "one of our best huntresses is Samigi. She's only young, and will have to stand down in a few months' time to have her baby. But of all the huntresses in the village, I think she's probably the best choice." "I see," Reyes commented. "What is the normal gestation period for a harpy?" Quinnigoff looked at Reyes, her mouth partially ajar. Evidently this was the sort of thing he should already know. "About 4.5 to 5 months, my chief." Reyes nodded. Gaggara was about a month gone. No wonder she was already showing so much. A few short months from now, probably in the middle of the coming winter, she was going to be having her baby, assuming things didn't take a turn for the worse. "Might Samigi be the poisoner?" Reyes asked. "My chief," Quinnigoff said, sounding a little confused. "She was with your old chief when Gaggara and I came barging into the hut. Might she have done this in order to seek revenge?" It was a thought that hadn't really occurred to him until he had heard Samigi's name mentioned again just now. "I think that's highly unlikely, my chief," Quinnigoff assured him. "Samigi might have gotten a bit of a scare, but she also got her child. She has no reason to harm either of you." "I wish I could be certain of that," Reyes commented. "Who else did you suggest to Heshkov?" Quinnigoff smiled. "Young Jonathan is off on her rite of passage today. She hasn't yet proven herself as a huntress, let alone a suitable replacement for the chief's bodyguard. She was my second choice, my chief." Reyes said doubtfully. "You have to understand the game, boss," Tanegi said tiredly. Quinnigoff gave Heshkov 3 alternatives, but only one of them could possibly make a good bodyguard. Jonathan might surprise us all and bring back an elf or something, but it's unlikely. "So who was the third choice?" Reyes asked. "Padadi," Tanegi said. She yawned again. "I don't know her," Reyes said. "She's over 30, Tanegi replied. "She's lucky she still has some use to us, and hasn't been sent to Lappenwalt. She'll never make a good bodyguard." "So, Samigi it is," Reyes declared. "Well," Quinnigoff commented, "in the end it's Heshkov's choice, my chief. But if she doesn't choose Samigi, then there's something wrong with her." "Samigi would make a good night guard, my chief," Tanegi agreed with a yawn. Tenegi seemed to be having trouble staying focused. She closed her eyes for a few seconds and then had to force herself to open them again. She lifted her hands to her eyes and tried to rub the sleep out of them. "You really should go and get some rest," Reyes instructed her. "You're no good to me if you can't stay awake." "But," Tenegi began to protest, "consider it an order if necessary. I want you to fly to the village and grab some sleep. I want you fresh and fully awake when you take your post by my side tomorrow morning." "I can't leave you alone with just Quinagoff for protection," Tenegi protested further. Reyes glanced briefly in Quinagoff's direction, and then he addressed Tenegi once more. "Quinagoff watched over me alone for the whole of yesterday without incident. I'm sure she'll be fine for one more day. I know I'd feel a lot better knowing that both my bodyguards are fully awake tomorrow while they watch over me." Tenegi still hesitated. She took a step forward, as if she thought that by doing so she might appear a little less tired than she was obviously feeling. Then she began to look around the courtyard. For a moment, Reyes wondered what it was that Tenegi was looking at. He followed her eyes as they searched the area. Then he saw a woman standing out in one of the balconies of the keep just above his head. She, in turn, was watching the harpies, but didn't seem all that concerned about their presence. Reyes recognized the woman. It was Alicia, Greythorpe's wife. "I can't just leave you here," Tenegi finally voiced. "Not among all these humans." "If they truly wanted to," Reyes explained, "the humans here could wipe our little village out easily. We have a small village. At a generous estimate, we have maybe 200 huntresses. They have close to 7,000 trained soldiers. I'd be no safer in our village than I feel here." "They could never get the better of our huntresses, my chief," Quinagoff voiced. Reyes looked sharply round at Quinagoff, trying to indicate that she wasn't helping with her comment. Then he looked back round at Tenegi. "Fine. What if Quinagoff and I were to return to the village with you?" "My first concern is always for your safety, my chief," Tenegi replied. She yawned loudly, slapping her hand over her mouth as she did so, in a vain attempt to cover the fact. "Right," Reyes told her. He looked wantonly back at the illusory curtain beyond which lay his beloved girlfriend. He would far prefer to forget all this and just dunk back in there. Reyes wanted nothing more than to spend the next week or so by Gaggara's side, making sure that she was really going to be all right, and keeping the love of his life company. He knew he couldn't do it, though. He had obligations, promises to keep. "Let's go. Tenegi, please lead the way." Tenegi yawned once again. This time she made no sound, but her mouth opened far too widely for her to have hidden it had she tried. Then, without any real pomp or ceremony, Tenegi took to the air. She flew up, until she was just above the old ruined walls of the castle, and then she flew in a slow, uneven, clockwise circle, checking the coast was clear of any potential danger in every direction. "It looks safe," Tenegi shouted. Well, to be honest, Reyes hadn't thought it would be anything other than safe in the air. Reyes glanced meaningfully at Quinagoff, and then launched himself into the air. It didn't take long for him to reach Tenegi and fall into formation beside her. Quinagoff was the last to join them. She flew up to the other side of Reyes, effectively sandwiching her chief between herself and Tenegi. Together, they completed one final circuit of the castle, and started off towards the eastern pillars of the encampment. They flew together, in an untidy triangular formation, back to the eastern pillars, each just far enough away from the next to account for their wingspan. As they flew, Reyes spent some time watching the peasants from their makeshift towns and villages going about their everyday business. It was the soldiers who seemed to be in every village that caught his eye. They didn't seem to be pressing people into service, but each small contingent of soldiers was training a small mob of peasants, volunteers to fight for the king in the war. Reyes and his two bodyguards came in to land just short of the eastern pillars. They specifically aimed for an area where the soldiers weren't quite so thick in number. The soldiers here had already gotten used to the presence of harpies just outside the pillars, and though some of them did reach for their weapons, not one of the soldiers took an offensive stance. Reyes felt that of the three of them, he was probably the least bothered by the soldiers. As such, he led the way, threading the path between the fires and trying not to get any closer than necessary to any of the soldiers. Anita didn't seem to be around this morning. Reyes wasn't too surprised. He assumed she had gone to answer the king's summons. For now, Anita's role at the eastern pillars had been taken over by Sir Duncan. Or was that Sir Fawkes that Reyes could see sitting over by one of the fires? Although Reyes had seen both of the king's knights when he had entered the encampment yesterday evening, no one had bothered to introduce either of them to him. Reyes only knew that it was one or the other of the king's knights because of the dirty and very worn-looking livery they wore over their armour. Whoever the knight was, he eyed Reyes warily. It hadn't been all that long since he and his partner had been given the order to kill Reyes on sight. Even now, the knight's expression suggested to Reyes that he would love to carry out his old orders. The knight didn't move, though. He just stood over by one of the few makeshift tents that were scattered about the campfires and kept his eyes firmly on the three harpies as they passed. As certain as Reyes was that he was safe inside the confines of the encampment, it was still a great relief when he stepped through the barrier and found his people hard at work on erecting their tents. Sometimes it seemed amazing at just how quickly harpies could work. For most of his childhood, he had learnt from the books of his father that harpies were lazy creatures that refused to work for a living, preferring instead to steal from their neighbours. Yet, as he returned to the village, it became clear that nothing could be further from the truth. When Reyes had left the village late last night to go and fetch Manglos, there had been nothing that had even vaguely resembled a hut anywhere in the clearing. Yet already today, with the sun having been up less than 2 hours, the first hut appeared to be nearly finished. It was still being worked on as the huntress added a few finishing touches to the building. "Looks like your abode is nearly ready, my chief," Quinnigoff commented. "My abode?" Reyes said. "The chief always gets the first hut, my chief," Quinnigoff explained, as if such a fact should have been self-evident. "The chief's hut is first, the leader's hut is second, and then everyone will work on building their own huts," Tanegi clarified. "But don't worry," Quinnigoff offered. "If you don't like the hut, they'll build you something bigger and better once the rest of the village has been erected, my chief." "I'm sure it'll be lovely," Reyes replied. "My needs are small, as long as there is room enough for two." "A chief's hut is always built with at least enough room for two, my chief," Quinnigoff replied. She smiled at Reyes. "Gaggara won't be needing her own hut. She'll be staying with me," Reyes felt he'd better mention. "That is most unusual, my chief," Quinnigoff voiced. "Where will the leader sleep while you're busy with a huntress?" "There will be no other huntresses," Reyes replied. Did he really have to explain this again? "For me, there is only Gaggara." "Yes, my chief," Quinnigoff commented. "Most unusual." Tanegi yawned. "Sorry, if you don't mind, I'll go and take advantage of that nap now." "You do that," Reyes told her. "I want you fresh and awake tomorrow morning. We're going to have a small errand to run, and I want you both to be ready." "An errand, my chief?" Quinnigoff asked. "Yes, we're going to Golespon," Reyes told her. Quinnigoff shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know it. Wherever it is, though, you shouldn't go. Let one of us go for you." Reyes shook his head, replying, "We're all going." He looked meaningfully at Tanegi. Tanegi got the message. She launched herself back into the air and flew gracefully across the clearing until she disappeared from sight. "Gaggara is right about you," Quinnigoff voiced. "You are too soft. Most males would have insisted she stay at her post all day, regardless of how tired she was." "Trust me," Reyes countered. "I feel far more secure knowing I'm protected by one able huntress than I would with one able huntress and one who is too tired to think straight, let alone shoot straight, should things suddenly go stale." Quinnigoff smiled grimly. "Come," Reyes told her. "We have a poisoner to find." Reyes walked slowly towards those gathered about the hut. There were only really a few girls working on the hut, but it made a nice focal point for the village, a good place for him to gather everyone together. Spear in hand, Quinnigoff followed close behind. Reyes couldn't see her doing it, but he had little doubt that her eyes would be flitting to each huntress in turn, considering each of those presents with the same level of distrust. "Hear me," Reyes declared. "Last night, Gaggara, your leader, was poisoned." "Is she all right?" It was the girl called Gaggara who had asked. She wasn't actually working on the hut, but rather standing under one of the trees that still grew inside the boundary of the clearing. There was no small amount of concern in her voice. Reyes turned his attention fully to the young huntress. Had he been asked before coming here if he had a suspect in mind, then Gaggara was it. It had been Gaggara who had brought food to Gaggara and himself last night, but more specifically, she had stopped him from taking the piece of meat he had reached for, and instead turned his attention towards the larger haunch. It was as if she had known the meat was poisoned, and Reyes wasn't her target. "She died during the night," Reyes told her. The harpies working on the hut stopped working and began to listen in to what their chief was saying. Elsewhere in the village clearing, any harpy in earshot also seemed to stop what she was doing. "I'm sorry for your loss," Gaggara said. She wasn't a good actor. She couldn't resist a small smile. Reyes glanced round at the girls on the hut and then at Quinnigoff standing just behind him. He considered what would be the best way to get a confession, and decided to try the direct approach. He looked straight at Gaggara and said, "Why did you poison Gaggara?" "Me?" Gaggara replied in shock. She looked at the gathered crowd, and Reyes couldn't help but notice that all eyes seemed to be turned towards the one he had just accused. "If not you," Reyes said, "then who?" "How would I know?" Gaggara replied, her voice little more than a squeak. "Gaggara was poisoned, and you brought me the food," Reyes insisted. "If it wasn't you, it must have been the cook." "Who was the cook?" Gaggara looked worriedly around at the gathering of harpies, and suddenly her hand shot out towards one in particular. At most, the girl Gaggara pointed to could be no more than 4 years old. "Her?" Reyes pressed, indicating the child. Gaggara nodded her head weakly. "And why would she wish to kill the leader? She's too young to benefit in any way from doing so." "I don't know," Gaggara suggested. "Perhaps you should ask her." Reyes sighed loudly. He glanced round at everyone who was listening. "Gaggara still lives, but," Gaggara said hesitantly. "Yes," Reyes pressed. I only wanted a child," Gaggara explained. "While our leader lived, no one is getting your company. I'm 10 years old. By the time your heir is born and comes of age, I'll be 18. I'll be far too old to bear anyone a child." "You thought if you removed Gaggara, things would be different, and you'd get your child," Reyes suggested. Gaggara hesitated for a moment, and then she nodded. "Maybe you should have left with the others," Reyes told her. "I could go now," Gaggara suggested hopefully. Reyes shook his head sadly. "You know the location of this encampment. Besides, you tried to kill the girl I love." Even now, Reyes felt hesitant to order an execution. He had been in charge of the village for just a few days, and this was the second time he'd had to order someone killed. He couldn't help but feel it didn't bode well for the future. Reyes sighed and shook his head sadly. He turned slowly and headed back towards the 2 gnarly-looking trees that marked the edge of the encampment. He planned to spend the rest of the day with Gaggara before he left on his errand tomorrow. "My chief?" Quinnigoff asked as he passed her. "You know what has to be done," Reyes replied sadly. "Yes, my chief," Quinnigoff replied. She shifted the weight of the spear in her hands. Before he reached the 2 trees, Reyes heard a sickening thud as Quinnigoff's spear penetrated the huntress's flesh, striking hard against the tree she had been resting against. Reyes liked to think that Gaggara had at least died bravely.